Crisis Control, brought to you by Zarelio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.
Hello, I'm Amber Sherlock and welcome to Crisis Control. In today's episode, hacktivism. While most online criminal activity online is driven by greed, some have a very different motivation. So who's at risk of a politically or ideologically driven attack? The list of targets is long and it might surprise you.
Hacktivism has come to the fore via the war in Ukraine, with hacktivists regularly taking aim at Russia. Data from Russian organisations has been leaked. Cryptocurrency payments have enabled hacktivist attacks. And in what's thought to be a first, hacktivists used ransomware to hold the Belarusian railways hostage to its demands, which included the release of political prisoners. War is high stakes, but hacktivism, the use of technology to achieve it, is not confined to conflict. Closer to home, hacktivists stole 300,000 emails from the Nauru police force earlier this year to protest against Australia's offshore detention. The group asking whoever was to win the 2022 election to close all overseas facilities, among other things. Hacktivists are also roused by environmental causes, and with rapid societal change and growing expectations when it comes to ESG credentials, businesses and investors, big and small, are on notice.
When it comes to hacktivism, there's no one more qualified to unpack it than our panel. Carly Winkler spent 2 decades in defence and is now Deputy Director at ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre. Also joining us, Alana, Professor of Cybersecurity and Behaviour at Western Sydney University. Thank you both for joining us today, much appreciated. Let's turn to you, Alana, first. What exactly is hacktivism?
Hacktivism, when you use technology, usually in a way that's controversial, in order to support a social or political cause.
Carly, what are the motivation of hacktivists and what sort of platforms do they attack?
Primarily ideological motivations, so they're not looking to extort for money and criminal behaviour, but to be publicly virtuous in the public domain. So a lot of the kinds of attacks that you'll see from hacktivists are really against public-facing platforms, websites, internet services used by businesses in a way that can advertise the work that they're doing.
Are they individuals? Are they groups? What sort of backgrounds do they come from?
Well, I think that's really changed. There used to be a lot more individualization about hacktivist groups and people who were, advocating on behalf of a particular cause. But of course, now with the internet, anonymization groups and platforms, things like Telegram, these people are getting together in groups and coordinating in a way that they haven't been able to previously. So it's a lot more organized. Groups like Anonymous are very public about their activities, and there's been a large amount of coordination, particularly following on from, Russia's war against Ukraine.
A lot of ransomware attacks lately, but look, it isn't the preferred way to attack for activists, is it? And why isn't it?
So ransomware is a tool more often used probably by criminals and countries who are seeking to get financial gain. Particularly even in the state actor space, countries are being funded by groups that are conducting ransomware attacks. Hacktivists can use it. It can be a way of pressuring organisations and applying blackmail, threatening to encrypt and not release their information unless they pay a certain amount of money or donate a certain amount of money. It's not preferred, mostly because, again, you have the risk that you might lose that moral high ground, which is the entire purpose of their hacktivist activities in the first place.
Alana, are we seeing a rise in hacktivists as we're seeing social environmental conflicts rise? Is there a correlation?
Many forms of hacktivism are perfectly legal, and there's recent court decisions in the US and Europe, depending on what you're doing, it's considered a human right, part of legitimate political protest. So that's really important for this podcast for people to hear. But then, of course, it's when you transgress certain lines and it becomes something more than that, that you're dealing with things that might be considered potentially ethical, depending, but also a bright line of legality. And so there's been a sharp raise for some forms of hacktivism, and then also a decline for some forms of hacktivism, depending on sort of the target and why people are doing things.
So it has been around much longer than people would suggest, but I guess what you're telling me is just changing with the times.
Exactly. So it's been around for quite some time, actually. And Australians are actually really quite famous hacktivists if you go back in history.
What's an example of a famous Australian hacktivist?
Julian Assange. In the early 1995s, you can go and have a look at the wankworm. So it's actually really quite documented, and it was a documentary done on television here with a group of students from RMIT and the Uni of Melbourne who hacked into, well, they didn't hack into anything. They hacked into the NASA systems as a protest of the Galileo rocket that was going to be launched into outer space through the then first nuclear engine. And they released what's known, technically, it's considered the world's first incident of an hacktivism worm. And all that worm did was write lyrics across everybody's computer at the NASA stations globally with midnight oil songs, and they called it the wankworm. So it's really actually quite a funny thing if you look back in time, but it actually didn't do any damage to any of the computers or anything. It was just like a statement to say, should you be doing this? And they actually delayed the launch of that nuclear rocket. And so that's an extreme example from a long time ago. But increasingly, people are starting to use technology in ways that not only for political and civil unrest, but it's moving towards vigilantism. And that's when it becomes really quite frightening, and in a way in which I think needs to be looked at in a little bit more detail. So you're talking about everything in terms of an attack. Some of this is an attack, but some of it, again, like I said, it's a political right to protest.
Carly, a recent example, the Russian war, of course, against Ukraine, it really changed the space when hacktivists were recruited for cyber warfare. Here we saw some success, arguably in the name of social good, didn't we?
We did, and Alana's point about this actually being a really valid form of protest, could not be more transparent than in the case of the Russian war. There were some really valid reasons for hacktivist activity during Russian war, but it really did change the space because we talked about the Russian war in Ukraine being the first true cyber war, and cyber war is a hard word, and it certainly hasn't been the kind of war that we anticipated. But for the first time, groups proactively collected a large number of people together. They trained people who didn't have necessarily particular cyber skills to conduct operations, and again, generally try and be difficult and disruptive, which had some good and bad cases, right? So the problem with untrained civilians playing in a warfare space is that it can interrupt legitimate state-sponsored sanctions and activities that are designed with diplomatic arrangements in mind and are also accountable. So, you kind of have to think at the end of the activities by a lot of the hacktivists, during Ukraine, if civilians and non-combatants were impacted, had their businesses destroyed, who's accountable for that? Like, who pays? And it's really difficult when you have groups that aren't organised or aren't accountable under UN humanitarian rights law, to sort of have groups that are really sitting back and considering what that impact could be on other people. And again, you have a group of individuals where that are behaving in one way, and again, we all had a little bit of a chuckle about the hacktivists in the case of Russia, because most of the world was fairly united about the fact that Russia's activities were illegal and should be disrupted in any way. But again, at the end of that set of activities, it's a group of individuals, and what happens when the next issue that they are now trained to conduct operations on, when that's less clear cut, we don't have one side versus another, but we have 10 different completely valid ways of addressing an issue. So it can be really effective.
Can you give us one of the most well-known examples of what these hacktivists did? Maybe the railways?
Exactly. So I think that's a really fascinating case. So in Belarus, there was a hacktivist group that got together and disrupted the Belarusian railway system. And I actually happened to get the opportunity to speak to one of the people who were involved in that and hear about how they did that operation, how they managed it, and how they, actually considered, because a lot of the people who disagreed with Belarus's activities in the Russian war were Belarusians, and they have the right to, and actually the responsibility to argue against the government who has chosen a course of activity that they don't like and they don't agree with. So they get the right to politically argue that issue, and so they did that through disrupting the rail service, but they also did it in a way that was coordinated by people on presumably on the ground. I mean, we don't want to attribute where anyone was for those activities because there's threat to life, but they did it with the good of the country in mind, which meant that they made really conscious efforts to try and limit the fallout onto innocent civilians and people just trying to go about their lives who also probably agreed. A bunch of difficulties that we have with hacktivist activities that are broad scale and not necessarily well focused is you run a risk of damaging those who would be your allies. And in Russia, for example, too, we don't actually want to disrupt the activities of people who are fighting against the regime. So the Belarusians really took a considered approach to it, and also they were the only ones that were operating in that space. So presumably, I mean, we don't know a lot about what the Western states were doing in terms of cyber warfare. That's obviously very sensitive information, but I don't think a lot of people were looking at Belarus for activities. They were all focused on how do you disrupt Russia, but actually working on the allies and making sure that people were looking at Belarus as well was, again, best done by the Belarusians, and they were really conscientious about it.
Alana, you said that hacktivism has been around for quite a while now, but do you think it's on the rise here in Australia in terms of a global context?
For Russian hack, I think that level of things that's happening in Australia is actually highly organized, and they're not training new people up. I think it might be a lot more sophisticated than what's been led on here by some of the actions that we're only starting to see on the hacktivist front. What I find more interesting is the YouTube channels at the moment out there that I've been having a look at, documenting how to do everything, who the targets are in Russia, and other, like, there's the whole channels dedicated to this at the moment on YouTube and Reddit and other. And so that's been, really quite interesting. Whether or not it's an Australian following, I don't know. I don't do the analytics around whether or not it's Aussies participating.
Alana, are we seeing much hacktivism here in Australia at the moment?
Hacktivism is always alive and well. In terms of metrics of Australians, they would participate in their proportion like people anywhere in the world. It's a global phenomenon that isn't linked to different jurisdictions. It's people that ally against a cause or a political action, and they can be united from anywhere.
Carly, if I turn back to you, are there particular businesses that are at risk that these hacktivists are targeting?
Well, it can be a real range, and I think everyone's potentially interesting to lots of other people. So surprisingly, smaller businesses are attacked often as larger businesses, partly because larger businesses are better defended. So if we're talking not just social protest and social activity, but groups that are seeking to actively disrupt, it's often, smaller businesses can be easier targets. So if the goal is to steal some secret information from a business because, the motivating factor is that, a group don't particularly like what this business happens to be doing, then, it can be a real range of different types of activities. So it could be, steal sensitive information, it could and expose it online, it could be damage their ability to operate. But it really depends on what the motivations of the groups are and what the issues are. I mean, in terms of small and medium-sized businesses, probably the best advice that I could give is just double check that you're on the right side of good on whatever the issue is. If it's a matter of, we know that a number of big businesses, for example, ASPI did some research last year looking at slave labor in China in Xinjiang province, where people were being used to in sweatshops to make sneakers and products that are consumed by the West and used and supported by very, very large companies. And again, if you expose that activity, it's really on those companies to make sure that they're actually not doing something that is inherently and morally wrong. But assuming that that's not the problem, there are a number of ways you can defend against people who are just seeking to disrupt operations.
And what are some of those ways, apart from being morally sound? What practically can people do to protect against it?
Well, I think that try not to give them further ammunition. So engaging online and feeding the trolls, for lack of a better expression, and having a big online dispute is more likely to just continue the particular activity. Again, giving them lots of public attention, if that's what they're seeking, is a way to continue the protest. Try not to be an easy target. So, get a security vulnerability assessment, patch systems, and use the cybersecurity industry. There are a lot of ways of protecting systems and a lot of good advice that's out there. Have a look at the Essential 8 if that's not something you're familiar with. The ACSC put out information about that. And it looks at things like using multi-factor authentication, access controls on networks. Don't let a particular piece of software, your Instagram account, for example, access budget records and things that they don't need to have access to. And tighten down your systems. And again, prevention against attacks like DDoS, dedicated denial of service. Lots of ways of protecting against that as well. You can buy additional bandwidth to make sure that if your website is about to be flooded or is being flooded, that you can actually cope with surges in volume. You can look at distributing your content behind CDNs or content distribution networks, so that instead of having all of your eggs in one basket, you can actually host different content in different locations that is more able to support businesses and be closer to customers. You can lock down your public-facing platforms. Know what normal looks like for your network so that you can tell what is abnormal and then find ways of blocking it. There's a lot of things that you can do. Again, if it is ransomware, make sure you have backups that you can recover your business from. But again, I think the big ones are really around people. So come up with a plan in advance about how you're going to respond in the case of an incident. Who are you going to talk to? Who are the teams who are going to kick into action if your business has been disrupted, or if your websites have been disrupted, or your systems aren't working? Test it in advance. Get teams to poke at your networks. Do pen testing, do red teaming to make sure that groups that are trying to actively attack your network while your defenders are trying to actively defend it. It's a really great way to find out where you're vulnerable, and particularly train your people. So people are the greatest vulnerability in any network on any cyber systems, because they click on links and they go to crazy websites and they do all sorts of things which aren't really very cyber safe behaviors. So make sure that your people know really good cybersecurity behaviors. You can get some cheap training that's out there, and I would encourage any business of any size to, at the minimum, make sure that they're training their people to help defend themselves.
Alana, do you agree with Carly that people are the weakest link?
And the one thing I would like to stress yet again, yes, hacktivists are a threat potentially to your business, but they mostly attack government systems, okay? The real threat is organized criminal syndicates in your system, and you'd want to do all of the things that Kylie just said because of that, not necessarily because of hacktivists.
Okay, do you see this becoming...
It's a reputation management and not engaging and fueling something. And then maybe just reviewing what it is they took issue with to make sure that maybe you're aware of what your company is doing, because sometimes you may not be as aware as they are with some of the things happening in your own systems within your business procedures and other.
Do you see hacktivism getting bigger and bigger in the future?
Yes and no. There's been a lot of high-profile litigation and criminal charges, especially in the US recently, some of which have resulted in really serious jail sentences. So that's a deterrent. But then there's also been some decisions that have come back and said, guess what? This is actually a completely lawful way of protesting in a democracy. And so it really will depend on what kind of messages the courts and governments and campaigns send out and what kind of deterrent measures are there, because you don't want this going vigilante. We don't want to move to a society where things are vigilante. And so the message is that, you know, many people are really tired of the systems and processes that currently exist that don't adequately address some of the acute ethical issues that we're seeing, not only whether it's local council or at the state level or the government level or the global level. And so hacktivism comes out of a sense of extreme frustration.
Carly, is there anything else you'd like to add before we go today?
I would just completely agree with Alana on that. You know, it's important to know that there's hacktivists as a group who are protesting social issues, there's criminals, and then there's people who are both. And the reality is that people who are conducting criminal activity, who are trying to break in, disrupt, steal, when it isn't a valid political protest, they're really the ones that you have to worry about. And again, particularly the groups who are getting financial reward for doing this, you'll find that their motivations are a lot less holy than real hacktivists who are simply trying to protest. So it's really important to make sure that we have a good understanding of the separation between those things and focus on getting the people who are legitimately bad. And honestly, that's the criminals.
Alana, I must ask, where, if anywhere, do social media platforms fit into this picture?
There's whole YouTube channels dedicated to nothing but hacktivism, Reddit channels, IRC. And so people do mobilize. But for me, the interesting thing of following this over well over a decade is sometimes the causes that get up are really surprising, and sometimes the causes that don't get up at all are equally surprising. And you actually need a fair amount of people to come together to decide it's something that they really want to take issue with.
And that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Carly and Alana, for your time. We appreciate you being here. Now, let's ask a CISO.
My name's Heng Mok. I'm the Asia Pacific Japan CISO at Zscaler. So I guess with you know, those sort of business challenges, what we're seeing in the cybersecurity space is really the emergence of a new cybersecurity architecture, and really that has been the shift in order to meet these business drivers and business change is really the adoption of security service edge, or the next, I guess, coined by Gartner in 2021. This particular framework, you know, helps organizations be more agile, support their business needs, and essentially, you know, you're able to apply this architecture in the cyberspace to securely connect, you know, people that are working anywhere, and you're able to apply the same security policy, whether these particular employees are on the network or off the network. And essentially, I think that in this new business model where organizations are being more agile, being more flexible, this type of you know, security architecture provides organizations with a way to be adaptive to meet their business needs, but also, you know, minimize risk for the organization and support their goals in being able to find that balance between the employee experience as well as keeping organizations safe. So I think that that's the next big thing in cybersecurity.
And that wraps up Crisis Control for this week. I'm Amber Sherlock. Thanks for watching.
Crisis Control, brought to you by Zarelio. Cybersecurity experts protecting Australian businesses and organisations so we can all be safer together.